Hey everyone, welcome back to our next event again for Big O Development. Today we're really excited to hear from our speaker, Ken Willis, who's going to be talking about topic developer productivity at scale. Right, but as always, before we begin, I think let's just go through a few introductory topics. Next slide. Yep, so to Jiaxing.
Thanks, Yuan, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining us on a Saturday morning from Singapore. But for our speaker, Kent, it's Friday evening for him. And we are super excited for the session. So just a brief introduction to developer space. If you are not familiar, we have a physical space in the Google Singapore office, but due to COVID, we shifted everything online. So that's how we started our YouTube channel. And we regularly host events with developers and startup communities, such as Big O Development. Do subscribe to our channel to keep updated with all that's happening.
Yep. So back to Big O related social goodness, as in all our social channels, I mean. So if you have been following us, you might have already known some of these links. But if not, do check us out in our different social links over here. Of course, our main site, Big on Dev, where you can find all links to all our other social channels as well, like for Medium, which we actually didn't place here. But also our main channels where we release news in regards to our events, like for Facebook, as well as for live stream, going to YouTube as well. So if you're watching from our Big O channel, big hi to you over there. So do check out these social channels. So every time we have an update on any of our news, we'll definitely post it on these different areas.
Yep, and similarly for developer space, we also are on all these social channels. Do follow us on our website and our mailing list, as well as Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube.
And yep, this event itself is live at multiple different channels. Today, in fact, it's mostly just GDG Singapore as well as for Google Developer Space. So yeah, if you are watching from this YouTube channels or Facebook channel, right, do type in some comments on the chat. Let us know you're there. We also engage with the speaker via the chat later as well, right? Okay, and as always, as part of for our group, usually we also want to look for speakers who want to talk on different events. As some of you might know, we also affiliated with GDG Singapore, and we're always looking for speakers who want to talk about a topic that they are interested in. And it doesn't necessarily need to be related to a topic that we are looking at today. It can be related to other Google technologies, for Android, Kotlin, Flutter, or even cloud technologies. If you're interested, and if you're, let's say, working on some side project, or you have some project in a company that you've been working on and you really want to share with the community, this is a good starting point. Do write in, check out that link, write in to us. We'll look through a proposal and we will get in touch with you, and hopefully schedule you up in one of our live streams to talk to our audience in regards to what you have to share. So looking forward to all the submissions that will be coming in.
All right, and as always, here's a short word from our sponsor. We are working, not really working. We are hosting in Hubble office right now. Thank you for the venue. We are safely socially distancing at the moment. Probably not gonna happen after this event. As you might know, Hubble is hiring. Some of the projects that Hubble has been doing, right, as a construction tech startup, is that the software that we build is actually being used in Jewel at Changi. It's being used in building Razer HQ in Singapore, as well as the Punggol Digital District, among many other projects in Singapore and outside. So if you're looking for transition out of where you are and want some cool stuff working with us, want to enjoy life with us, please do reach out to us. We are looking for software engineers, front-end, back-end, mobile, DevOps, data. We are looking for people in marketing, BD, sales. The company is rapidly expanding, so please do reach out to us if it's an opportunity that you would like to enjoy. Also, we do have Sean, right, from Immersive Labs will be talking to us next month about application security. So this is something that it's very rare. We hardly had any topics on security. So if this is something that you're interested in or your friends are interested in, please do invite them to join us. Sending it back to Wei Yan.
So, as mentioned earlier on, we are really excited to be hearing from Ken in terms of his knowledge and sharing in regards to today's topic. So, as you all know, Ken is the director of engineering at Yelp, and he currently leads the engineering effective organization at Yelp, supporting all engineers. Number that's more than 500. Additionally, he leads a group that's focused on reducing bias in the interviewing pipeline for individual contributors. He was also previously involved in helping young women learn more about the tech industry and giving them a head start with the Built by Girls program, and is active member in the AWE mentorship program at Yelp. Right. So, as mentioned, really excited to hear from Ken. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks so much for that intro.
So, shall we move to your sharing? So, I will switch over to your slides.
Sounds good. Thank you. Yeah, I can take it from here.
All right, take it away.
Great. Yeah. So I'm super excited to talk about developer productivity because this is something that I think about every day with my organization at Yelp. Before we go into the developer productivity stuff, I just wanted to start with talking a little bit about Yelp. And so Yelp's main mission is to connect people with great local businesses. And we have over 200 million reviews and over 30 million unique app devices currently today at Yelp. The number we gave earlier was, greater than 500 engineers, but I'll even update that more. We're greater than 900 engineers in offices based in San Francisco, Toronto, London, and Hamburg. We also, have been fully remote throughout this whole time during COVID and plan on continuing to support remote. And we have engineers that are remote in the US, Canada, UK, and Germany. And so I guess a little bit about me before I get started. I've actually been to Singapore before. I've also been to the Philippines. I spent a few years. I have kind of a traditional, non-traditional background. So the traditional part is computer engineering for my undergrad. And then I went into the military directly out of college. And that was actually my first experience in leadership. I was 22 years old and I was put in charge of 20 some soldiers right off the bat. So it was an interesting environment. And there were soldiers that were anywhere from 18 all the way up to mid 30s that I was working with. And I was actually stationed over in Okinawa, Japan for that whole time. And so I spent a lot of time traveling through Asia. After that, I came back and got my master's at University of Maryland for computer science. So I guess back to the traditional side of things. And I got the opportunity while I was at the University of Maryland to intern at Yelp. So I got my start interning at Yelp back in 2014, where I interned on the web core team. And that was really the start of developer productivity at Yelp. So let's dig in a little bit. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about developer productivity, why it's important, and what does it look like in practice when we're looking at a larger organization, particularly Yelp scale, which is, over 900 engineers, like I mentioned. So there's a lot of different definitions for developer productivity. And as an individual developer, you might think about some of the tools that you have to speed up your coding. It might be some things like autocomplete, maybe help with linting, like autocorrect on the linting side. It could even be your dot files that you set up for your local setup on the machine that you're working on. I think the definition that I chose is one I really like from Martin Fowler, and it's more geared towards what developer productivity is for a larger company. So he described this as a developer, it's delivering the maximum value to your customers, and it's being able to apply your energy and innovation in the best ways towards company goals. I really like this definition because it goes back to thinking about building products for developers in a way that is furthering the mission of the company. You're working at a company, and it's very easy to lose sight when you're working on really cool technical things, what you're trying to affect when it comes to outcomes. And so the next question you might have is, what does a productivity organization do? I mentioned this before, but for Yelp, I describe it as building products for developers to enable them in their everyday development tasks. And I think for Yelp, we have a separation between what we call feature teams who are working on different areas of the product, and then we have these horizontal infrastructure teams. And so the way I explain to the infrastructure teams what we do is by saying we let feature developers focus on what matters most, feature development. If they're having to not work on application code because they're getting stuck with the infrastructure that they're working on, then that's getting in the way of them shipping out those features and affecting the bottom line at the company. So this is what developer productivity looked like when I interned at Yelp. I actually pulled in a couple other teams here, but really WebCore kind of pulled off of the consumer group. And at Yelp, we have the consumer side and a business owner side. So you can imagine the consumer app might be something that you go to, say, yelp.com or the app in the App Store for. And so that would be the consumer side of things. And then for the business owner side of things, it's the business owners that own those restaurants or those local services. And so the WebCore team spun off of this consumer group to be able to solve this problem of scaling our monolith. There was also release engineering, who was also trying to solve this problem of scaling the monolith from a testing side of things. And infra was more like a service infra type of team where they were creating a lot of libraries that were wrappers around some of the server side code. So you could get started very quickly in a service. So 2014, 2021, we've grown immensely from the time that I started there. WebCore only had, I don't know, 6 to 8 people on the team. We have way more than that now. You can see about 8 teams design all the way across the stack. So design systems is working with designers and also has full stack devs. It's a multi-platform team. They're developing our component libraries across the board that our feature developers are using. Client data, that's actually one of our newest teams, and they're working on the GraphQL API that we have. So when you're building a feature, where do you get the data from? Well, you can just hit this API. And then we have a bunch of core teams that are across the board that support the communities that we have at Yelp. So WebCore, for instance, would support all of the full stack developers at Yelp. Core iOS, all of the iOS developers at Yelp. And it goes on there. Continuous integration and delivery, thinking about pipelines, builds, Jenkins, testing, and developer insights and automations. That's actually one of our newer teams as well. And that's where we're starting to do more metrics collection. And I can talk about that a little bit more. So it's a big space for us, and it's a big investment for us at Yelp. So why is this all important? Well, it can affect a lot of things: developer efficacy, burnout, employee satisfaction. I actually pulled these things from a space article. I've linked down here. We can provide the links later if you haven't seen this article before, but both Space and Accelerate are great references to check out. I think one of the interesting things for me with developer productivity is that it affects more than just getting code out the door, but it can actually affect developers' mental states in a good way or a bad way. If you're finding that you're trying to push out code out the door and you're getting stuck over and over and over again on something that you can't change, that can really burn people out and cause them to go elsewhere. Or it can take longer to get code out the door. Or they can, yeah, I mean, it's just going back to, it can burn people out. And that's not something we want in an organization. We want to create an environment that is sustainable. And so I put these metrics in here, and this is from Accelerate, and we actually use these metrics internally at the company: lead time, deployment frequency, mean time to resolve, and change failure percentage. That being said, when we started all of this, we didn't use any of these metrics. We started off with qualitative feedback from our developers. We sent out surveys. We did user research. We asked what the developer pain points were. And I guess even before that, before we even did the user research, we started with a problem for the company. And that problem for the company was that the monolith that everybody was developing in, the web monolith that everybody was developing in, was not scaling for the company. And we didn't have dedicated time to solve that problem because everybody was on a product team. And so it was a big enough problem that you couldn't just spend a few hours on and solve it for the company. And so this was the first time that we said, okay, we're going to dedicate. My predecessor asked my current manager, can we spin up a group to solve this problem for the company? Because if we keep on going down this path, there's going to be a point when we're not able to ship code anymore or ship code reliably anymore. So there was a progression here. The progression was solving immediate problems, then getting feedback from developers on the problems that they're having, and then now we're starting to mix in a little bit more of the metrics that we're collecting. And yeah, what does this look like in practice? Well, before I go into what it looks like in practice at Yelp, and I'll go through a bunch of examples there, let's talk about something that you use probably every day, and you probably, I mean, maybe you think about it as a developer productivity product, but maybe you don't. And I actually pulled off all of these features, just like a product has features, all of these features from the Get page. And really, this came out of a problem of like, how do you allow developers to continue to scale as they're working on such a large code base back in the day? That problem needed to be solved. This was the solution back in the day, and it was offered as a free solution, and it's something that everybody uses today. So if you are thinking about working on a new product, or you have a product idea, you want to get something out the door, where do you spend your time? Do you spend your time on creating the next source control management software? Do you spend your time on the next coding language? Do you spend your time on the next framework, the build system? Kind of see where I'm going with this? You probably don't spend your time on any of this stuff. This is probably just expected to be there for you to develop the way you need to develop to get code out the door. And so that makes a lot of sense too, if you think about it, because if you did have a product idea and then you said, oh, but I need to work on a coding language first, you're probably never going to get that product out the door. And so we've separated those responsibilities at Yelp. People can focus on the feature that they're getting out the door, or they can focus on one of these developer tools. That being said, we're not creating any coding languages at Yelp. So what did we do at Yelp when operations didn't scale? Well, first of all, what are the things that didn't scale? So I'll talk about the monolith a little bit, testing across the company, and ownership, how that didn't scale. So the monolith. The monolith didn't scale for many different reasons. We had hundreds of developers, and in 2014, we had, I want to say, 200 or so developers. We probably had a couple of hundred developers pushing code. We had dedicated pipelines for pushing code out the door. So you had to get into the morning, afternoon, or evening push. Sometimes we would have 20 to 30 branches in each one of those pushes. And what happens when you run the test suite once everything is merged together and tests don't pass? Or what happens when all your tests pass, but you roll it out to production and you start getting a bunch of errors? So this started to become a problem where when you increase the number of branches that you're trying to push to production, you're increasing the probability that there's going to be a rollback. And that was a problem that was increasing over time for us. And what happens when you roll back for a morning push? Well, it can affect your afternoon push. And now instead of having 20 people that need to get into the push for the morning, now you have potentially 40 people that need to get into the afternoon push. Sometimes you just cancel pushes altogether. So you can see it starts to become a pretty big operation to start working through all of this stuff. And not to mention that this web app was over 3 million lines of code. So you're increasing the complexity when you're developing in that code base. You're not going to be able to wrap your head around everything that code base does. And actually, that is kind of a skill that you learn very quickly, is how to develop code in a small portion of a large code base in a way that is reliable. Migrations would take quarters. And in fact, like we had dedicated people focusing on migrations for the monolith. Performance wasn't great. It would take 40 plus minutes to build the monolith. The test suite would take, we have a great stat where it said it would take 2 days to run all the tests sequentially. So it was something that, it just is not feasible for people to run tests. Obviously, you don't run tests sequentially, but still, there were a lot of tests that needed to run, almost 100,000 tests that needed to run. And so this was a big deal. We had to figure out how to scale that. And web workers now need gigabytes of memory, which causes a lot of scaling issues on the production side. So we came up with this solution, like everybody else has come up with this solution. Microservices, although I always cut out the micro part, they're just services, a bunch of services, over 300 services that we ended up creating in this space and that we have today. And we had to figure out, like how we run the tests. So we built a distributed test runner. We had to figure out how to encourage people to move out into those services. So you can't just build the infrastructure for the services and say problem solved. You have to be able to get the code out into those services. And that's not straightforward when you have all of the code that's kind of tangled up. So how do you do that? Our approach was originally starting from the bottom up. That didn't work. It was complicated. So we ended up starting from the top down. We took visual pages and we said, let's pick a simple page to start with and let's move that over. And this is actually one of the things that WebCore did very early on is they would grab simple pages, move them over, and then we started to define a style guide as we started moving pages over to really just ease that process of moving things over. It was a whole large process, a lot of different steps. And I guess to give you a little bit of fidelity on what we ended up doing here, and I don't know if this is too typical for a lot of companies, but what we wanted to do was start breaking it down to each page being served by a different service, and we would call that a front end service. So you can imagine something like the business page, which is the bottom right image, and the home page, the top left image, is served by a separate service. And you can see there's a bunch of different components on these services. So I borrowed this term from Netflix. I really like it. We also have what we considered a paved path at Yelp. And basically for us, that means that it's a standardized solution that we support for that we directly support, and we give first class support to. So the teams that I showed you before are one of those teams is responsible for one of these solutions. So there's a couple of things here. So how do we, as we go to services, we now have a bunch of new problems that we have to solve. So don't think that like when you go from a monolith to a bunch of services, all your problems are solved. No, you just have a different class of problems that you have to solve now. One of the things we had to figure out is, okay, we don't have a one place where all of our style definitions are. And in fact, even in the beginning, we might have had different styles from page to page. And so our design system, in fact, we called that the style guide back in the day, was how we ensured that consistency of styles. And we packaged up some libraries to be used across services. Testing across service boundaries now starts to become an issue. Do you want to spin up a couple of services? Well, how do you do that? Well, we chose to use Docker. And so if you have a bunch of Dockerized services, how do you instrument them and spin them up? And keep in mind, this was pre-Docker 1.0 days, and Docker Compose wasn't so much of a thing at that time. We had a few people working on Docker Compose at Yelp, and then it kind of spun off from there. We ended up creating our own thing that was called Yelp Compose, and we still use that to today. And that's our way of orchestrating a bunch of containers for testing. How do we migrate things now? So before, we would have a dedicated team that would do a migration for the monolith. And now it was too much work. All the services had to be migrated individually. And that actually is a little bit harder to do now when they're not, when you're going from code base to code base. So we had things that would track migrations that we were doing, given all the services. We had a way of automating changes across all of those services. And then later on, the naming is hard. We had this thing called Yokyo Drift. In the past, we called it Bumpy. But it was basically this idea that over time, the dependencies that you use on your in your services are going to drift, hence the name Yokyo Drift. And so you're always going to have newer patched versions, minor versions, major versions. And so how do you keep up to date, and how do you encourage teams to keep up to date with those services? Going back to how do you encourage teams to move out of the monolith, it's not just making it easy to show them how to move out by compartmentalizing logic, but it's also adding in templating for services when they need to spin up a new service. So that's easy. Having developer playgrounds if they want to spin up a service and see what it would look like in production. And there was a lot of evangelizing to go around from team to team to get them to focus and take time for this. And then I guess last but not least, we had to think about quality across the board. When we had one place to look, we could put in a bunch of checks in that one place to make sure that we had the quality that we expected. Once we started having hundreds of services, it becomes prohibitive to start checking across the board if people are meeting the standards that we have for code. We do code reviews, but that's not enough all the time. And so we had a couple tools there. And I just want to call out that this is like not an instant thing. This is something that we have spent many, many years working on. In fact, we had the style guide probably back in 2013 before people were even coining the term design systems. And it was really just something that we needed at the time to be able to support going from the monolith into services and having consistent styling. This is what our design system looks like today. It's really pretty. Check it out, yelp.com/style guide. And we have this cute theme as well, where Yelp has the cookbook design system, and it goes all the way from ingredients to recipes to entrees. This is an example of migration status. I've redacted some of this stuff, but it's not really important here. This would be an example for a core team that's trying to migrate something. So this is something we used back in the day, the Google Closure compiler. If you want to learn more about it, you can go to that link below. But ultimately, we moved off of that in favor of some modern JavaScript frameworks. So we use Webpack as our bundler, and we use React mostly in the JavaScript space. But one of the things in doing this migration is first you have to show how you can move to React given the ecosystem we're at today. So if you have something that builds JavaScript and then you have a new thing that builds JavaScript, how does this all play well together? If you have packages, JavaScript packages, how do you make sure that typing works across packages? So when we're thinking about these migrations, we're always thinking about incremental forward and backward compatibility and then tracking this over time. Yokyo Drift, helping people see what is out of date for their dependencies for a service, and also making it as easy as just clicking a button to bump the dependencies, run the tests, and then put a pull request up for you to review to see if everything is good to go. Precommit is a great one that actually came out from my mentor when I joined Yelp. And this was something that was super interesting because I remember when I joined Yelp, he had so many nits on my code review. This is Anthony Satilli. And he would go across a bunch of engineers' code reviews and call out style issues, and it would take a lot of time for him. And actually, Precommit was a way of really automated a lot of the tasks that he was doing. It's expanded out much beyond that now, but it's a really cool way of adding in some automation for things that are pretty routine, like being able to do some flake checks for a Python, and maybe even auto fixing things. So if you can think about it, it's like if you're writing an English paper, you should also think about like that affects you want to think about the readability of your paper. So you might think about grammar and whatnot. So on code, you kind of have a similar thing. Style is super important. I guess there's a lot of things in that space, but some of those things are automatable, and Precommit helps us do that. And we use that on all of our projects. And then pgctl, that's something that I worked on as an intern. It was a playground controller. And I think this was something that I worked on with one of my other mentors, Buck. And he had this, he basically wanted to take the bash scripts that we had, which were not reliable at all. When you spun up a playground, sometimes you couldn't shut it back down. And so this was a way of like spinning up a web service in a dependable way. And you could just do playground start, playground stop. And it would even put a nice URL up there for you with your handle, your internal company name, so you could view that web service internally. And then this is something that we actually use today. This is eemetrics, engineering effectiveness metrics. And we have an internal tool called the ownership service. I'll talk a little bit about ownership later on, but because we know who owns different entities across the company, we're able to surface a page for each team and tell them areas that they should focus on. So another piece that didn't scale well is testing. And I alluded to that a little bit earlier when we were talking about the monolith, because the monolith was not scaling. We had over 100,000 tests that we had to run for the monolith. We're really big into, if you write your code, you also write tests with your code. But what happens when you do that? Well, you have a lot of tests. We had over 100,000 tests, and every developer would run their tests for their individual branches. We were running tests a lot. More than 300 runs were triggered on a typical day, and we would have 30 to 40 simultaneous runs. So we came up with a distributed system for running those tests. And that was the release engineering team that worked on that. And so that's what that looked like. I'm not going to go into detail for today's talk. So we also, as we run the tests in a distributed manner, well, before you could view your tests in your console, but once you send your tests to go run somewhere else, how do you view your tests? So we actually created a UI for navigating the test suites that you ran. And so going back to, we created a paved path, a solution that was fully supported, both on the back end and the front end. And this really gave us new capability. It allowed us to optimize test runs globally. We could rerun flaky tests for people to see if it was actually a problem with the test, that the way that it was written, or there's a problem with your code that was written. And then we could also automatically blacklist that test and tell the owner of that test to go fix that test if it was repeatedly flaky. We could randomize tests when we're running them so that we could identify whether or not there's test pollution. We could share historical test runs with people so you could see if this test was actually failing 90% of the time for users and it needed to be blacklisted. And we could also share a more up-to-date outage information. So if the distributed system was down for any reason and you were getting a bunch of errors, we could surface that really quickly so that you didn't have to spend a lot of time thinking it was your own code that was broken. And this is actually kind of a cool thing that we were able to do. So we automated a lot of things. We could say in the past, 20% of other runs failed with this traceback. And so if you start to see that, then, okay, maybe it's not your fault, like when with the code that you wrote, that this test is failing. And so you can see the visualization of the test runs in the past. And you can also quickly write up a ticket that'll pop up in Jira for the person to go and triage that test. And there's kind of two things here, right? There's the unblocking you to get code out the door for the monolith. And then there's the other piece where long-term we want to increase the quality of our tests that are written. And ownership. This is actually something that most people don't think about that much when an organization scales. So when you get to a lot of developers, who wrote the code, who's responsible for the long-term maintenance, what happens when the developer leaves? You can't, like when we started, you go back to the Git history and you see like who wrote it. Well, what happens if that person left the company? What do you do next? And I think the way that we changed the way that we thought about ownership was we went from individual ownership to team-based ownership. And teams do change, but they change less frequently than individuals change at companies. And when you have team-based ownership, you have let's say, org owners that will be changing the teams, and then they'll also have a checklist for those teams when they're doing that that switch for the team, and they'll see like, oh, well, I need to move all of these entities that are owned by that team. Whereas if an individual leaves for a company, we're not gonna change the Git line to say that is now owned by somebody else. I'm just checking the chat here too. I think what I can also do, if I miss some comments here in the chat, we can go back and address some of these as I get through this. yeah, so I'll come back to some of these questions that we have in the comment section. And I think we're almost through my slides here, so we can address those during the question time as well. So also, who's responsible for the maintenance and migrations of services? So when it goes beyond just the code that's written, what if you have a bunch of people that have written code in a code base? Well, we started to add metadata to these services and tie ownership to those teams. And we've actually tied ownership to a bunch of different entities, and I'll show you what that looks like. So this is an example of the ownership service. It's for the ad syndication team, and you can see there are a ton of different entities that we have here. Swagger endpoints, Sensu, Get repos, data stores. Apollo is just an internal API. We have Jira, we have Jenkins, a lot of stuff here. And back to eemetrics again, because we're doing team-based ownership, it's really useful because now we can have a team page. For this one is the continuous integration and delivery page. And we can give a roll-up for that entire team for areas that they need to focus on. You'll also notice at the top that we have some metrics like code quality, developer velocity, reliability, and security. We just use a heuristic for coming up with the scores there. And this is something that we're constantly adapting. And we actually built eemetrics before the Accelerate article and book, the Accelerate book was widely shared out. So we've been kind of adapting some of those internal tools to reflect that more. And so that's just kind of a quick dive into some of the stuff that we've been working on. But this is really just the beginning for us. We're realizing that as we're standardizing our tooling, we're actually able to add a bunch more functionality than we really realized before. So we're building products and we're going, oh, there are new features that we can add here that are super helpful. One of the more recent things, so a lot of the stuff that I shared today is stuff we've been working on in the past, but some of the more recent things that we've been working on today is I guess the team that we just spun up, which is the client data team. It's an internal API for getting data from the backend. And, you know, before we had probably 3 different ways of getting data. And that meant that there were three different ways, basically for 3 different platforms: iOS, Android, and web. And then you also had biz and consumer, and they had different ways too. So you multiply that by 2. So we had a ton of duplicative code. And so having a standardized service across the board where you can get that data is one of the ways that we're making it easier for developers to develop today. And that's really interesting. And I'd be happy to talk about that more if people are interested. Okay, so with that, that's what I have to present. So let's jump into some questions.
Hey, thanks, Ken, for the very insightful knowledge that you've shared with us. So we'll start with some pre-submitted questions, and we also go to the questions from the audience. So do send, for those who are watching the stream right now, do send in your questions if you have. Okay, so I want to start off with a question in related to content from what you've just shared. So I think this is something, personally, I faced this as well, coming in from a startup where we're faced with a monolith. And, we know, like, I think what you shared just now, things like the Dockerization, containerization of applications, I think those are very useful information. But I think the bigger question, to companies like that usually is, how should I start?
Yeah. Man, this was the problem that the team had to solve when it was spun up. It was like, how do I take this monolith that's 3 million lines of code, and how do I start? How do I actually start to get code out of this monolith? And I think there are a couple of things that are really important there. We started to think about, like, how are we actually going to share code outside of the monolith? So what we started doing is packaging up some of the core functionality and kind of like detangling that in the monolith and making libraries. So you would have Python packages that you could now reference. And so we would move the code out of the monolith, move that over to a library, and now reference that library in the monolith, but as a package, right? So that's one way, but like that still doesn't address the complexity issue. And I think that was the piece that we had tried. We tried to do this from the database side first, from the bottom up, and we didn't succeed there. And so my predecessor came in with this idea that we could start with a UI. And we started with one of the most basic pages that we could port over, which was actually our Yelp careers page. So it was something that didn't have, you didn't really have to hit a database for. You could hit maybe your Lever API or something like that if you had to do job postings. You had to maybe think about a couple of elements on the page, like a button or some layouts for the page. But what it did was it started to compartmentalize the problem. And what we did is we started with something super simple, and then we ramped up. And oh, by the way, as we're doing this, we're starting to package up libraries, not just in the Python side, but also in the JavaScript side, also in the styling side, to where we're now starting to be able to actually just develop in these services. Now, when it comes to moving something larger out, we would have to go in and have a dedicated effort there to scope out what are the dependencies here. Is this actually going to be really tough to figure out, or do we think we can detangle it? One of the little hacks that we did was we actually had the request go through the monolith, and then we had the monolith send down a request to the front end service. So we would route through the monolith and then go down to the front end service. And the reason why we would do this is there was some logic and functionality that was just really tangled into that monolith, and we just didn't really know how to pull it out, and it was really unsafe to pull it out. It could affect our public metrics that we report to the street, a lot of different things that were important to the company. So what we did is we would pass some of that information through the request header down to the service. And now what that did is it solved the complexity problem. We could, like the stuff we couldn't package up, we could still get that functionality down to the front end service. But long-term, it created scalability issues for us. But that was a problem that we punted down the road and said, we'll solve in another couple of years.
Awesome answers. Thanks for sharing. Just want to follow up on another aspect of this question. How about the human side of things? I remember you mentioned about the evangelization. So I'm thinking that that's more about convincing your team members, developers towards that. This monolith to services approach is scalable. It's a good move. Was it challenging doing that?
Yeah, so I think what I might do is pivot to talk about a different technology that we were trying to roll out. So I think with the monolith, it was apparent that we needed to solve this problem. People were excited about moving out of the monolith because it was a pain to work in the monolith. Now, that being said, sometimes if you're looking at product timelines, they would say like, okay, we can't actually spend time to work on this. So there was a little bit of evangelizing that we had to do there around saying like, okay, what is the scope of work here? And is it worth like delaying the product getting out? So there's a back and forth there. But I think where this actually ended up, and this happens a lot with our developer productivity organization, is there's new technologies that come out. And we were pretty much like vanilla JavaScript. We use a little bit of the Google Closure compiler back in the day, but that was really just to really have small JavaScript files. And then, there was this big thing around Angular and React and like, okay, which one do we adopt? And so we had teams one team internally of the company that was like, I'm going to start developing in React. We're like, whoa, wait a second. It was like, we're trying to solve this one problem of like getting code out of the monolith, but now we got more things that we're going to have to manage here. And I remember talking to the manager about this. I said, you can move forward with developing in React. However, how are you going to get the style guide styles in React? How are you going to do like X, Y, and Z? Do you understand that you are fully supporting the space? And then, oh, by the way, when we decide what we're going to support at Yelp for the paved path, whether that's Angular, React, or whatever we decide to go with, are you going to be willing to do the rework to move from whatever solution you've built to the solution that we're going to be supporting? So there was that really like hard conversation in the beginning. And it was kind of like, can you just wait just a little bit for us to like figure this out and how this will work for the company as a whole? Because that team is just thinking about how it's going to work for the team, but we need to think about how this is going to work across the entire company. And different teams have different developer environments. So I guess to say this is something that it's a constant conversation when you're talking about bringing in new technologies to the company, and there's constant communication that you need to have there.
I love the example. Thanks, Ken.
Cool. There's a bit of a question around engineering productivity metrics, actually. So maybe we can start off with this, and then we take in some of the audience's questions. So Kent, earlier you did talk about, engineering effectiveness metrics. Can you tell us a bit more about, how you use it? How did you come up with those metrics? And I guess monitoring.
Yeah, sure. When we started effectiveness, like I said, we did not have any metrics. And so the first way it started was we were just solving a problem for the company. How do we scale the monolith? And then the second thing was like, okay, once we're starting to solve that problem, what are some of the other problems that we may not know about? So we needed to start talking to the communities that we supported to figure out which areas they were having trouble with when they were developing. Now, the whole metric space has actually been really a new area for us. And I've actually, I put this as a link earlier, but I got this by my desk. And you can see I got all my notes. But those 4 key metrics are from this Accelerate book. And I think one thing that I really like about these metrics, well, I guess there's a couple things. The metrics are trying to define outcomes, and they're low variability metrics. So I guess that's a lot to say, but low variability, like, so they don't change as much, they don't jump around a lot, so you can kind of get a better read on what's happening. Output versus outcomes is a piece that they talk a lot about in the book. And one of the examples that they use is, let's say you wanted to measure lines of code. And you can think about if you used lines of code as a metric, well, how would you do that? So if we say like, oh, well, a lot of lines of code is a good thing. Well, is it? Right? Like, do we really want to push our developers to write a lot of code? What happens when they're just writing garbage code? Or like it becomes harder to read because they're just putting a lot of code in the repositories. Okay, well, let's go the other way. Let's go to like the least amount of code that they can write, right? Well, what happens when they optimize the code so much that it also becomes unreadable? So you kind of get stuck there with trying to use lines of code as a metric, and it kind of misses the point of what you're trying to do. And so I like the 4 key metrics because there's a balance between developer velocity, which are the first 2, and then reliability, which are the second 2. And the first 2 are more like, you can imagine if you were focusing on like speeding things up, getting code out the door really fast. That's great. But then what happens when your site keeps on going down? That's not so great. And so the nice thing is there's like this push-pull between these 2 metrics where you're probably not going to max out either side. And it gives you a nice balanced look between the 2 sides. So I guess that's why we adopted these metrics. And that's actually not something that we came up with. That's something that we got from this Accelerate book, and we use it today.
Cool. Thanks, Ken.
Yeah.
Actually, we do have a question from the audience as well, very similar to this one. So Harry Zuan was asking, earlier you did mention about developer velocity, and then any thoughts around, like what do you mean by that, and like, I guess similar to what you mentioned about the lines of code.
Yeah. So this is so the book goes into this a little bit as well. So I'll talk a little bit about lead time. And lead time is like trying to capture getting the code out the door from inception, from thinking about the product feature that you want to write to getting that out the door. Now, that was like the mindset behind why they came up with the lead time metric, because it was the outcome of getting this code out the door. Now, there's a problem with that because some of the time is what they call like fuzzy time. And it's the hard to measure time where you might have a product manager that's thinking about the problem for a little bit. You might have data science that's doing some analysis. You might have design that's doing some designs here. And then it finally gets over to the engineering side. And so what a lot of people have done is start to measure this cycle time. And that's kind of when the developer maybe starts their branch to getting the code out the door. So when we're talking about developer velocity in that instance, we're talking about like how long does it take for that developer when they start writing code to get code out the door. I think there's a second part of that too. What if a service is somewhat stable? The component that shouldn't be changed so frequently. So I think maybe this is getting at, do you need to have a fast developer velocity for something that doesn't need to be changed? And I think the answer there is when we talk about lead time, we're talking about measuring something that is observable and that happened. So when you're talking about a stable component that doesn't need to be changed, there may not be any developing that's happening on that component at that time. So we wouldn't be looking at a lead time for that component. This is more about like the development that you are doing. How efficiently are you doing that?
Cool. Thanks, Ken. Actually, Heidi has another follow-up question, which is very close. So yeah, so his other question was, what are some of the tools metrics that you use to judge code quality? I think you kind of hinted about that a bit already. Do you want to kind of elaborate more? Kind of remind us?
Sure. Well, I think right off the bat, I'll say that we do code reviews at Yelp, and they're done by like maybe a mentor on the team or a tech lead on the team. And so there's an element of code quality that comes into play with just having your code routinely reviewed before it goes out into production. Now, this is talking about like measuring that and how well that's happening. Now, this is a space we haven't really dug into that much. I think we've started from a space where we make sure that people are writing tests for the code that they're writing. We have general like principles for the code that they're writing, like you might use the Python style guides, and like so there are things that we say like should be done, and then the question is like some of that, can it be automated? And we talked about Precommit is a tool that we use to automate some of those changes. And then we can look at the reliability of the service. But I think like from a metric standpoint today, we're not actually trying to judge code quality from a metric standpoint. We're more trying to just look at outcomes for the code that we're shipping, and then asking the question is there a place where we need to get a closer look at what's going on in that service?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Ken.
Hi, Kent. So I think earlier in your presentation, you were talking about the developers using Angular or React.
Yeah.
So we have a question related to that. That is, how do you balance between engineers' desire to learn new things versus agility in using existing tech?
Yeah, this is also a very common thing that happens. I think the important thing to kind of go back to is that these frameworks, these languages, these tools that we use, they're all tools in our toolkit. And just because you're not using the latest cool new thing doesn't mean that you aren't able to learn as a developer. And so I think that's probably the like not so sexy bit of this, where it's like there's maybe you want to work on the latest thing, but that doesn't define you as being a good developer or a bad developer. There are challenges that you can solve, whether that's scaling challenges, infrastructure challenges that you can be solving day to day. Now, that being put aside, I think one of the things that we saw, not just with like say React and Angular, was also when we were looking at typing. for JavaScript. We were trying to decide whether or not we wanted to go with Flow or TypeScript. And it really got down to these seem like pretty similar constructs. And we started to look at adoption in the community. And at the time, we had to make a guess to where the adoption was going to go. Because when we're thinking about supporting this for our group, we're trying to think about when's the next time we're going to have to do a migration to the next thing because this is no longer supported or whatnot. So we actually picked the one that is less supported now. I think TypeScript is really taken off, and we chose Flow back in the day. And so that's a decision that, like, I think we still made the right decision back in the day, but now it's something that today we're going to have to think about how to migrate potentially to TypeScript in the future. So I guess that's to say from our side, the infrastructure side, that this is something we're constantly thinking about and constantly balancing. When do we bring in that new thing? Because adoption happens so quickly and code gets written so quickly when you have 900 plus developers that the migration to move off of that is going to take some time. Hopefully that gives a little bit of an answer to that question.
Yeah, I think at that point of time, with the limited information you have, I think that's when you have to make a decision. And looking back, it's always easier. Yeah, I think we have a question from Chester, which is sort of related to technical debt. So earlier you were saying that instead of just an engineer owning it, it becomes a team. So apart from just changing the ownership model and modularizing code into services, are there any other approaches that the Yelp teams take?
I think actually, I think I'll take this idea about compartmentalization, and I think we've kind of taken this to the extreme. I think one thing that we noticed with the monolith is that when you have to wrap your head around everything that's happening, that just, it slows you down and you make mistakes. And so if you can kind of limit the scope of what you have to think about when you're developing, development speeds up much quicker. So they talked a little bit about like going down in services, but we also were modularizing the code itself. In apps, creating separate modules, creating separate packages, so that when you're actually writing in the service, there's very little code that you actually have to sit there and process. I think as far as like managing technical debt, we've actually not really changed our approach in the sense that we always come up with an incremental way of solving that migration. We, as a infrastructure group, we think about the problem as it applies across all of the company, so that when we ask somebody to do that migration, we've thought about all the hard parts, and now it's just simply going through some simple steps. And so there's how we can support the organization to always keep things up to date. I would say maybe the place where we have changed a little bit is the way that we communicate across the organization. Communication has to change a little bit as the organization grows. And so we've used this eemetrics tool as a centralized place for people to see what migrations need to happen. And then we're constantly working with teams to figure out what's effective and what's not effective, so that they can understand the changes that they need to make before it creeps up on them, and it causes a blockage in the product pipeline. That's kind of a failure case for us, right? Like the debt has piled up in an unseen way, and somebody's writing code and then they go, wait, I need the latest style for this cookbook component, and I can't use it because I need to bump this package like 3 times. And that means I got to bump all these other packages. This like dependency happens, and you don't even realize the complexity that's building up over time if you just leave it be. So we are spending a lot of time trying to keep people really up to date with a lot of their migrations so that the complexity is super simple when they're trying to get code out the door.
Thanks a lot. Yep, I think that answers Chester's question.
Okay, so we're going to move to another question from the audience. So this was one of the earlier questions that was sent earlier on. So we have a question from Ganesh on, I think, part of a presentation where you talked about testing. So he's saying that UI testing is too costly to manage and maintain. What about using contract testing instead?
Yeah, so this is interesting because I think we've kind of gone back and forth in the space, I guess. We started off just going, we need to test everything with Selenium, and we were going to actually like spin up the service. Like Ganesh said, like that is very expensive, and that's very expensive when you're talking about spinning up a monolith. I think there's a couple of different things to think about here. Contract-based testing is one of them. I think also talking about best practices for your testing. I don't know if you've heard of like the testing pyramid, encouraging to have a lot of unit tests, less integration tests, and really small amount of acceptance tests. So I think these are all solutions that you try to bring to the table. I think the challenge is how do you create that environment for the company, and how do you make it easy for people to do the right thing? And so we try to think about what these best practices are going to be. We try to make those best practices easy for people, where we create the infrastructure for them to do those things in an easy way, and then promote that out at the company.
Awesome. So one follow-up question, again from another member of the audience, someone to round up that answer. Maybe if you can share with us what testing frameworks or what libraries do you use in Yelp?
Oh my gosh. This is something that I have not been in the coding space for a while now. I could probably say that like we use Jest on the JavaScript side. We used to use like Mocha, Chai, Sign-On, all of that stuff, but that was like more back in the day. I'm not quite sure if I don't think we use many of those anymore. For Python, we use like PyTest, and I'm not sure what we use in the Java space. Predominantly, our group has mainly supported both JavaScript and Python. Sorry, you'll have to pull in one of my engineers on the core web team to come in and give you these detailed answers for the frameworks and libraries we're using.
No worries about that. But thanks for the answers for both the questions.
Yeah.
Ken, so like in Singapore, I think I did mention off the air that one of the things that we are starting to think about is growing the developer productivity team, because many of the companies now are scaling to hundreds of engineers.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have some thoughts around when exactly should we start thinking about it?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a tough question because it's going to be dependent on the organization. But I can talk about our own experience, and I think for us, we started thinking about having people solving long-term problems when we kind of looked in the future and said, we're going to start having a problem at our company if we don't actually start thinking about this today. So that can be kind of a cue. You notice that there's a little bit of friction getting code out the door, and you're going, wait a second, what's going to happen 6 months from now? Are we still going to be in a good state, or is this going to be something we need to think about? Now, the other thing that I think I should probably mention. Now, I've never personally worked in a startup. My wife has actually worked in a bunch of different startups, and they've never had a developer productivity team. And I think the thing to think of that about there is like, if you haven't hit your product market fit, then you might want to probably be focusing on just hiring the right people to write good, quick code, and not worry about providing all this infrastructure to make all the developer or help all the developers follow best practices. Because you can imagine, like, you spend all your time in that. And, I had a slide on that earlier. Like, if you're not focusing on getting the product out the door, you might not hit your product market fit and the company may go under. So, like, that's your priority for the company at that time. And only you as a company can kind of figure out when you're starting to get into the space where you're starting to turn that wheel because you found something that's working with the audience that you're supporting.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Thank you, Ken.
Yep.
Switching gears a little, Kent. So you have been at Yelp for, I think, more than 7 years. And we wanted to ask more about your career journey. So how do you, maybe for yourself, how do you decide whether you should jump ship or stay in the current company? What's the threshold between comfort and growth?
Yeah. I mean, this is going to be very personal from person to person. I think I have a couple of things here that could be really interesting to talk about. For me, being at Yelp for the time that I have, I had amazing growth. I started as an intern on the core web team for a individual team that has now turned into 8 teams that I'm now the director for that organization. And so that has been a fantastic journey of learning for me, going through being a engineer, being a first line manager, and now being a second line manager in that organization. The other thing is, like, the people that I work with every day at Yelp are just so fun and engaging, and they have so much knowledge, and they impart that knowledge on you when you're working through challenges. And so that's great to be able to come into a workplace that you love and you enjoy. So I mean, I think that's, like, for me, that's what drives me and keeps me at Yelp. But I think when you're thinking about this for yourself and at the company that you're at, I think, a couple of references that would be like maybe a good share. So let me share my screen here. Give me 1 second. Yeah, you can go ahead and put that up now. Okay, great. So my wife is in the growth space. She had actually shared this article with me. Bengali wrote this article, and he talks about career progression and how to think about your own career moves. And I think this is a really interesting framework for thinking about your own growth. And, like, you can even see there's, like, this question: should I leave my current role? This is perfect, like, for the So, well, how do you evaluate whether or not the role is giving you what you need in your career? And there's a ton of things that you can think about. And it's interesting too, because he talks about, sometimes you can be drawn to compensation over like the actual impact of the work. And so thinking about what you're actually going to be doing, the scope of what you're going to be doing is super important. Goes through a couple of like statements of like that you might tell yourself, well, I'm not going to jump ship because I just need to work on myself a little bit more before I get that next opportunity. So kind of walks you through it a little bit. By the way, I don't know Bengali, but I just thought this was a good article. So this can maybe help this person who's asking this question to try to create a framework that's important for themselves. Now, there's that. I'll share another thing that I think is important to look at. Sorry, this is a really interesting space for me because I think about the growth for my engineers and my managers every day. And so I have a lot of thoughts here. So let's spend just a little bit of time here.
Sure, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
So this other one is called Flow. And I always struggle to pronounce the author's name, but it's like Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And
Wow.
so this book is talking about how you can kind of get like what is this state of flow, this feeling of kind of being fully engaged into what you're doing and really enjoying what you're doing. And it's a really good, it's outside of tech. It's a really good way of just thinking about the work that you're doing today and whether or not it's the right work for you. And then I'm going to go ahead and switch to this other. I brought up that book because I want to share a picture from that book. Okay, go ahead and share that. So over on the right side here, they talk about this balance between difficulty and skill. Maybe I can. That's not helping. You can Google this like chart difficulty versus skill. And the interesting thing about this is if you think about being at a job where you don't have you basically have low you don't have the skills that you need, but then it's a very difficult situation that you've been put in. It's going to make you very anxious. You're not going to be very happy in that position. You're constantly going to be stressed because you're trying to meet deadlines in a space that you're just even trying to hang on in, right? Mm-hmm. And then on the other side, maybe there's very low difficulty, so it's like super easy for you to do, and like you have a high skill in that area. But what does that start to build? It's complacency, boredom. Like, am I really actually learning in my job? And so when I'm thinking about growth with my managers or with my engineers, I'm thinking about that balance of skill and difficulty and thinking about that progression over time. So their skill is going to improve over time. So now it's time to ratchet up the difficulty in the space. Those are the references that I think are a really good foundation to think about for this problem of like, should I stay where I'm at or should I go somewhere else? You can kind of evaluate, am I learning where I'm at? Is that something that I value? Am I getting the compensation that I want? Am I enjoying the people that I'm around? All of those things. And then I guess the other thing that I would bring up is have you had this conversation with your manager? Which can kind of feel daunting and scary, because you also have to ask yourself, like, am I in a safe space where I can share this with my manager, that, you know, I'm thinking about going somewhere else, to a different company, or I don't know if this company is the right place for me. And I think the reason why for me it's important, and at Yelp it's important, is because I view myself as someone who's trying to help you in your career progression. And if that's at Yelp, that's great. If that's outside of Yelp, that's fine. You know, but what I want to do is help you navigate that situation. And I want to maybe even provide you opportunities that you may not have even realized that were there, that could actually challenge you. And also maybe kind of highlight to me that, like, we need to actually start digging in and working on, like, are there things that we can address today, to help you grow in your role? So that would be my challenge, there, is that if you're thinking about going somewhere else, think about having that conversation in a one-on-one with your manager about that.
That's really interesting. I really love the diagram of the flow. Yeah, I think we all have a new book that we can start reading. Yeah, just have a quick follow-up question regarding that diagram, right? So you were talking about the balancing between skill and difficulty level. I'm wondering, so the team that you're managing, are there any that, let's say, decide that they are contented to stay at where they are at? So you might know that they are bored, but are there any that just say, you know, I'm good where I'm at? And how do you handle how do you handle that?
Yeah, so we didn't always have this, and we introduced levels at Yelp, I guess a couple of years ago, or maybe a year ago, and we actually have a blog post. I can put it in the private chat, and then you all can share it out. But I think levels helped us really define as a company what we expect from our engineers. And so we have a couple of beginning levels, let's say like IC1 and IC2, and we say that everybody needs to progress beyond IC1 and IC2. But then we might say, like, at the mid level, or like an IC3 level, that is what we call a terminal level. And that means that if, as an engineer, you're fully content at the level that you're at, then we're perfectly okay with that, at Yelp. And that might be like the project lead level for a team. And so I think, like, you know, for us, it's, yeah, we're fine. We're fine with that situation. But it depends on where you're at in your career progression.
Thanks a lot.
Sure.
All right, so we're going to go to the last question for today. This will be a question from the audience. So I think this is kind of a classical question about imposter syndrome. So Aaron's asking, have you ever had to deal with imposter syndrome when you're leading a team of very capable engineers?
Every day. I mean, I think this is something we're all faced with. Keep in mind, I came from school to Yelp without industry experience. I had worked at Army Research Labs for an internship, and I'd worked at the patent office for an internship that was non-coding. So, like, I didn't really have much experience coming into the company. And then, so I had to figure out a lot of things. And then I got this opportunity to manage the team. And I had a lot of very capable people on my team that I was managing. I think the thing that I realize though is that the management skill, the leadership skill, is a little bit different than that technical skill. And I think so that's one separation. So I don't need to be as technically talented as the engineers on my team. They're going to drive forward those solutions, and that's great. And that's the space that they'd love to be in, and I want to empower them to solve those problems. If I'm jumping in and solving those problems for them, then why are they there, right? So I think that's a bit to call out here. I think the other thing too is you're never done learning. And so like, I think it can be hard to do this, but acknowledge when you don't know something. And so when we talk about imposter syndrome, it kind of brings up this feeling of being scared to show that you don't have the knowledge in that position, or that you shouldn't be in that position. But I think the really important thing is to be authentic in the position that you're in, and to be transparent that you don't know that thing, and that you need to work forward, and we need to work together to solve this problem. And so that moves you out of this space of fear, when we talk about imposter syndrome, into the space of I'm constantly learning and I'm constantly getting better at my job. So hopefully that helps when you think about this space.
Definitely. I think that was a really good answer. Thanks for being upfront with us as well. I think most of us would have faced imposter syndrome on the perhaps some of us more often, some of us less often, but still most of us would have that once in a while. But with that, I think that was a really great question to end off today's live stream. So thanks, Ken, for joining us today, spending, I would say, like close to almost 2 hours now. Like that thing, sharing your knowledge with our audience, as well as answering our questions, helping us to grow in our own respective careers, as well as our companies as well. Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was great. And I'd love to do something like this again.
Awesome. Okay, so we're gonna move on to our closing slides for today. All right, so for next coming month, of course, we are gonna have activities for next month as well. So do look out for on the 4th of August to one. We're gonna have a talk by Sean on application security. Right, so very important topic, especially any product you work on. This is definitely something that's required. Okay, and just to reiterate our message from earlier on, we're always looking for speakers. It doesn't matter whether you are an experienced speaker, if you are a first-time speaker, if you are looking at doing this for the first time, right? We definitely invite you to come along to our events and take our event as sort of like a jumping board to start with. So do check out that link. Write into us your proposal on what topics you want to work on. It can be a side project, it can be something that you're focused on in your company, and we'll look into it and get back to you. And as mentioned again, earlier on we talked about our social channels, so do check out our social channels, our events, right? Earlier on we talked about the event in August for speaker Sean. We'll be posting more details on that on our Facebook group, so do go check out our Facebook page, as well as our YouTube channel, again, where our stream is going to be going to, and our website, where we will post calendar events on what's the latest things that's coming next. And yeah, with that, we have reached the end of our live stream today. Thanks for joining us, and have a good Saturday ahead.